What are the 8 things you probably haven't been told about owning an internationally diversified property portfolio? So in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the things you might not be aware of or you haven't been told about owning an internationally diversified real estate portfolio. And before doing that, go over to adamfire.com, especially if you're an expat or a high net worth individual and are looking for assistance in your investing journey. Now, many of my clients are interested in international property, and we have assisted many clients in getting things like expat and non-resident mortgages and so on. And I myself have lived overseas for over 10 years now. So I'm speaking from experience when I talk about the things you might have not considered and the things you haven't been told per se about owning real estate overseas. The first thing is a lot of the people who have it regret it. Now it's interesting, I was speaking to a client a few weeks ago who said it was always his dream to have real estate in different markets around the world, but once he knew the reality, he actually thought that just renting or Airbnb is better and having liquid investments is much more easy in terms of time and so on. So what's interesting is that's a commonality I've heard from numerous of my clients, that many of them don't regret buying a primary residence, but having 3 or 4 or 10 or whatever properties around the world, sometimes they actually just want to sell out and stay in good hotels and Airbnbs and so on. So one of the major reasons is time, which we're going to get to later in this video. Now, number 2 is renting isn't dead money. Renting can be a good deal or it can be a bad deal. One of the most widely read videos and articles on my blog is speaking about renting isn't dead money. I should put it below this video as well. And basically there is a formula for looking at where it is better to rent or buy. Now it's true when it comes to your primary residence, that's very different to a rental property, but still, number 3, linked to number 2, is that yield and leverage is key, not capital growth. And I'll tell you the reason why. Let's say you buy a house in cash. Not many people can do that, not many people want to do that, but let's say you do it. Let's say it's a cheap market and you can't get a mortgage as an expat or a non-resident. And let's say that property doesn't have a good rental yield, for example. The only way you can make money from that property is if you sell it on later on. In other words, somebody else is going to pay more than you paid for it. That's a speculation. In comparison, if you know you're going to make a 7-8% rental yield, that's not a speculation. Yes, that might go up and down or whatever, but you know you're going to get that. And likewise, if you're able to leverage the returns by putting down 5, 10, 20, 25% down, and the property value doesn't really go up much, but you're still leveraging, it's not as much of a speculation. Of course it is to an extent, but not as much as just buying something in cash and hoping that the price goes up. So in the overseas market though, it can be difficult to get good expat mortgages at good rates. In some countries they want 20, 25, 30, 35% down, and that will affect your return on investment compared to, alternative investments out there. Number 4, there is an inheritance tax risk. If you've got assets in numerous countries and they're not in a 0% tax country when it comes to things like inheritance tax, there's always a risk that you're going to actually come into that category. So I'll give you an example. If you're a British person, like most countries, changing your residency or your tax residency or even your passport is much easier than changing your domicile. So if you're a British person, for example, and you've lived 50 years overseas and you just have an offshore investment portfolio, which is in stocks, bonds, and so on, it's much less likely that you're taking as much risk as if you have a huge property portfolio in the UK, for example, because then the domicile issue becomes an issue. Now, don't get me wrong, domicile becomes a very complicated issue, and we're going to be doing more videos and free resources on that in the future. Domicile is something to consider when it comes to inheritance tax as a British, or not just British, for many expats. But when it comes to a asset like real estate, it's even more of a risk, because you're actually, especially if you're putting the asset back in your home country and you're an expat living overseas. So just bear that in mind. But also if you have property in 10 or 20, 30 countries, you've also got the issue that it might not be easy to sell those particular investments. So therefore, you should consider whether it's not better to have liquid investments or have something like a trust or an insurance policy, a life insurance policy, to cover your beneficiaries if something happens to you and they get a tax bill. Number 5, it can be riskier than investing in a real estate investment trust. Now, if you invest in a fund, a real estate fund, which is globally diversified, you might have access to hundreds of different companies around the world. In addition to that, sometimes you can leverage it in terms of some investment brokers will give you a margin loan, which yes, can be a bit risky, and it's not something you should do without an advisor. But the point is, if you just buy 5 or 6 properties, it's very debatable whether that's actually less risky than investing in a fund that has hundreds or thousands of different real estate components within it. And of course, the fund, in addition to that, is usually not taxed as much and it's less hassle. So for example, you've got to consider, if you're making 9% per year from direct and conventional real estate, but after fees and taxes, you're down to 6%. If you're making 5.9%, for example, from the investment fund, then obviously adjusted for things like the hassle and whatever, the fund is the better option. Which links to number 7, which is when you adjust the return on investment to time, often it's poorer than people think when it comes to real estate, because the time aspect is huge. Just 1 or 2 weeks ago, I was at a government office and there was a guy on the phone, I think he was British judging by his accent, who was getting very het up because he was having to certify a document at the government office for a sale of land. And it was clear that the process was taking a lot of time for him. And I've seen that in numerous countries around the world. Number 8, or number 7, should I say, luck is a huge factor when it comes to outsized returns. Now, what do I mean by that? Basically, some of the real estate markets that have done very well, like New Zealand or China or whatever in recent times, a lot of people didn't see it coming beforehand. For example, when I was in China in 2007, I was in Shenzhen, which at the time was the fastest growing city in the history of the world. And the price of some apartments was £30,000, or that was $60,000 at the time. And many people thought rightly that this looks very cheap, but there was obviously risks. However, very few people saw what would come next, because after the global financial crisis, the Chinese government stimulated demand for property, which meant that the price went very, very high very quickly, although selling out of those homes wasn't always easy. But then a few years later, many Chinese buyers bought in Australia and New Zealand, some Indians as well, and that pushed up the price much higher than expected. But what's interesting is most of the people didn't see it coming. And what is shown, or what shows that, should I say, is a lot of the people I know who were quite keen, for example, on Chinese property in 2007, they got the next prediction wrong about real estate. The next hot market didn't actually come to pass, so to speak. So 1 or 2 of the people I know who suggested Chinese real estate also suggested Egyptian real estate, but obviously they didn't see the 2011 Arab Spring coming. So when I've seen those outside results in real estate, luck has been a big component of it. So therefore, don't just chase the next hot market. Don't just chase the trends happening now. More look at fundamentals like the rental yields and how much you can leverage, as opposed to thinking, oh, this city and country is growing, so I'm just going to sell out to the next person who comes after me. And finally, there is a risk with bigger developers. So a lot of people assume that developers are always low risk, especially when it comes to those big name developers. But the reality is, even if you're dealing with a well-known and big developer, you can still face a huge risk that the development won't go ahead. I've met several people who have lost a hell of a lot of money, sometimes $500,000 or more, because the development didn't go ahead, and it was with big developers. So they didn't do the usual due diligence you might do when it comes to developers. Having said that, there are positives about real estate too, obviously. Sometimes it is much cheaper to buy than rent, for example. Likewise, in some countries, you can kill 2 birds with 1 stone, and it can help you get a golden visa, although sometimes there are different ways of getting a golden visa, but obviously there are some non-financial reasons why you might want to get real estate as well. You might just want it for long-term residency, because a golden visa indirectly is the closest thing to permanent residency in some countries. And also some people these days just want it for diversification. They're not trying to beat their stock market portfolio or their primary business. They're just looking to diversify, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But if you go overseas looking for those huge returns in real estate, usually it's based on a lot of speculation, a lot of risk, and don't think it's easy to pick the next New Zealand or the next China. You could be predicting or picking, should I say, the next Egypt or Tunisia or the next Thailand, because Thailand also suffered after the 2014 coup. So always bear in mind that risk and return obviously very much exist in real estate like other assets. And if it was so obvious that a market is going to be the next big thing, then everyone would be investing there, right? All the big banks, all the big hedge funds, everyone would invest in that market if it was so obvious in advance of time that that market was going to be the next big thing.
Depends on every person's individual goals, how much money they want to invest, how long they want to invest. And I did not have at all the feeling from any bank with which I had contact with that they were interested in these things. Mm-hmm. Whereas with you, it was from the very beginning obvious to me that you had experience in these matters and also were interested in what I wanted to achieve.
Anyways, I'm very, very pleased and positive to say that I believe I've picked the right one. The results in the last couple of years have overreached my expectations by far. And I see no reason why it should not continue. Of course, I can highly recommend him as your financial advisor for now and for the future, because hesitating is missing out.
So I'm investing a lot in the Middle East market, but the amount of returns I'm getting from there is very low as per the amount of returns I'm getting from the investment portfolio which you made for me. Obviously, the best result in market right now is Adam.